In the dim corridors of forgotten archives, where dust coats the bindings of files no one dares to open, shadows whisper of operations that never appeared on official maps. The world remembers the broad strokes of history, the armies, the treaties, the victory parades, but hidden beneath are fractures sealed by silence. These are stories carried not in textbooks, but in the margins of erased reports, in orders scrawled hastily then burned, in radio transmissions that ended mid-sentence. They live in the gaps between words, in the blacked-out lines of censored documents, where truth was cut away and memory rewritten. What remains is not certainty, but an echo, suggesting that beneath the surface of every battle lies another war, one fought in secrecy and buried with the weight of secrecy itself. To listen is to step closer to the shadows, where the line between fact and rumor blurs, and where the silence is often more telling than the words that survived. Chapter 1: The Vanished Convoy to Murmansk. In the winter of 1942, the icy waters of the Barents Sea became the stage for one of the most unsettling episodes of the Arctic convoys. Official accounts describe Convoy PQ-17 as a catastrophic naval operation, scattered by German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers, its losses accepted as the grim cost of supplying the Soviet Union. But a deeper examination of files, fragments of testimony, and missing documents suggests something darker: that PQ-17 carried more than tanks, food, and aircraft. It carried secrets, and its destruction may have been no accident. The convoy departed Iceland on June 27, 1942. 35 merchant vessels, escorted by close protection destroyers and supported by a covering force of heavy cruisers, plotted a course for Arkhangelsk. The Arctic routes were treacherous, bitter seas, constant daylight, and enemy patrols operating out of occupied Norway. British First Sea Lord Admiral Dudley Pound issued the orders that would prove fatal, an infamous signal at 21:11 on July 4th. Convoy is to scatter, it was explained, later as a defensive reaction to intelligence that the German battleship Tirpitz had sailed to intercept. But no Allied submarine pickets or aerial reconnaissance ever confirmed Tirpitz's presence. Historians still debate why such a drastic order was given. The scattered convoy was easy prey. U-boat wolfpacks already in position sank merchant after merchant. Luftwaffe torpedo bombers flying from Banach and Bardufoss claimed the rest. Of the 35 vessels, only 11 reached Soviet ports. It was one of the worst Allied convoy disasters of the war. Yet behind the military loss was another story, one whispered among naval officers and buried in correspondence stamped, "Most secret." Survivors from the merchantman SS Paulus Potter, before it was abandoned, reported that German aircraft seemed unusually precise in their attacks, bypassing other ships to focus on a single freighter at the convoy's heart. That ship, according to a memorandum by Commander Jack Broom, escort leader of PQ-17, was the SS Empire Tide. Official manifests list her as carrying general cargo, tanks, and aviation fuel. But a fragment of Admiralty records unearthed in the 1970s references special stores aboard Empire Tide, bound for Arkhangelsk under sealed guard. Some researchers believe this was early radar equipment, possibly components of the Type 271 surface warning set, rushed to the Eastern Front to aid Soviet defenses. Others argue it was ultra-derived decrypts, copies of German naval Enigma messages intercepted by Bletchley Park, intended to demonstrate to Soviet intelligence that Britain had penetrated German communications. Whatever it was, Empire Tide never reached Russia. The ship was torpedoed by U-457 on July 4th after the scatter order, and survivors claim the vessel exploded with unusual violence. A Soviet intelligence report obtained decades later through defector testimony describes German raiders salvaging sealed metallic containers from a sinking British vessel and transporting them under armed escort to Kiel. These reports cannot be fully verified, but they align with unexplained gaps in German naval records from July 1942, including a missing log entry from the cruiser Admiral Hipper, which was reportedly active in the Barents at the same time. Admiral Pound's signal remains central to the mystery. Pound, already in declining health, defended his decision by citing decrypted reports of Tirpitz's sortie. But post-war declassified ultrafiles show Tirpitz never left its anchorage at Altenfjord until much later, and German signals had been misinterpreted or deliberately exaggerated. Some researchers now suspect the order was not an error, but a deliberate measure to prevent PQ-17's special cargo from reaching the Soviets. Churchill's relationship with Stalin was strained, and British officials feared revealing too much of their cryptographic advantage. The disaster, while tragic, may have served to obscure the disappearance of sensitive materials. In 1946, Soviet authorities submitted an inquiry to the British Foreign Office, demanding clarification about missing cargo. The files, stamped with Foreign Office reference FO 317-157087, remain partially redacted. What is visible is unsettling. Repeated use of the phrase technical consignments and references to non-disclosure for reasons of national security. The Soviet complaint was quietly dropped after the start of the Cold War, but their intelligence services continued to collect testimonies from convoy survivors for years afterward. Norwegian fishermen later told Allied occupation officials in 1945 of unusual German naval traffic along the Finnmark coast in July 1942, involving fast boats carrying large crates transferred under guard to railway transport heading south. No official report links these movements directly to PQ-17, but their timing is suspicious. The Americans too showed interest. OSS memoranda from September 1942. Reference: loss of cryptographic material during PQ-17, though no direct evidence survives in the released archive. For the men who sailed in PQ-17, the disaster was remembered as betrayal. Commander Broom, who led the convoy escorts, later sued historian David Irving for libel when Irving claimed Broom bore responsibility for the disaster. Broom won his case in 1970, but the proceedings left a deeper question unasked. Was the convoy sacrificed for reasons never revealed to those who risked their lives? The silence surrounding PQ-17's classified cargo grew louder after the war. In 1953, when Parliament debated compensation for convoy veterans, one MP raised the issue of unrecorded stores aboard lost vessels. The comment was struck from the official record. Veterans associations long suspected that PQ-17 was more than a supply run. Some hinted at betrayal, others at incompetence. Few believed the full truth had ever been told. Today, researchers comb through the remaining fragments. The Admiralty files are incomplete, with key communications missing from the night of July 4th. Soviet archives remain sealed. The wrecks of PQ-17's ships lie scattered across the Arctic seabed, their holds frozen tombs of what they once carried. Modern expeditions using sonar and submersibles have located several hulls, but salvage operations are blocked by international agreements. It is possible the truth lies at the bottom of the Barents, locked in corroded steel containers never meant to be seen again. What remains is a silence too deliberate to ignore. Was PQ-17 a tragedy of misjudgment, or a deliberate act of misdirection to conceal a shipment Britain never intended the Soviets to receive? The answer is buried in classified cables, missing convoy logs, and the frozen seabed. Until those records are unsealed, convoy PQ-17 will remain not just a military disaster, but one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries of the Second World War. The question lingers: whose interests were truly served when the convoy was ordered to scatter? And what was lost in the ice that July night? Chapter 2: Ghost Airfield Beneath the Black Forest. By April 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling under Allied advances. Yet in the Black Forest of southwestern Germany, reconnaissance aircraft reported something that official records would later deny. Aerial photographs captured by the US 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group showed what appeared to be a network of runways carved into the dense woodland near Freiburg, with camouflaged hangars and cleared tracks running in geometric patterns. These images, logged in mission reports dated April 16th, were forwarded to SHAF headquarters under the notation Potential Luftwaffe Dispersal Site. Weeks later, when infantry patrols pushed into the Schwarzwald, they found nothing but forest, sealed tunnel entrances, and abandoned farmsteads. The official line would claim misidentification. Yet for decades, soldiers, engineers, and locals whispered that a hidden airfield had once operated beneath the trees. The site in question lay between Freiburg and St. Georgen, deep within the wooded hills where the Luftwaffe had established dispersal zones for its endangered jet programs. Allied bombing had devastated open airfields, forcing German engineers to experiment with subterranean facilities. Surviving fragments of German documents reference Project Morgenrot, a late-war program to conceal, Heinkel, He-162 jet fighters and Arado, Ar-234 reconnaissance aircraft in underground shelters, launching them from hidden forest strips to evade destruction. These files, captured in Freiburg by advancing French troops, were immediately transferred to American counterintelligence corps custody and never released. Eyewitness accounts collected after the war paint a chilling picture. Local residents described convoys of trucks moving by night into the forest near Gremmelsbach, their cargo shielded by tarpaulins. Some recalled hearing the shriek of jet engines echoing through the hills in early 1945, at a time when the nearest documented jet base was more than 100 kilometers away. One villager later told investigators he had seen young Luftwaffe cadets marching into hillside tunnels under guard, only to vanish entirely as the front collapsed. In May 1947, French engineers constructing a new road between Freiburg and St. Georgen uncovered metallic debris while blasting through granite. According to a report filed with the Direction Générale des Études et Recherches, DGER, the fragments included parts of turbine blades composed of advanced alloys not yet in common use. The engineers, puzzled, notified their superiors. Within 24 hours, US CIC officers from Stuttgart arrived, seized the material, and sealed the excavation. Witnesses claim the fragments were flown out of Baden-Baden airfield under heavy security. The French file was later stamped "transferred to Allied authority" and effectively vanished. Theories about the site's purpose grew darker with time. Some believed it was connected to the Wunderwaffen programs, experimental weapons designed to turn the tide of the war. The He-162, known as the Volksjäger, was designed to be cheaply built and flown by barely trained pilots. But the Black Forest installation, if real, appeared more elaborate than a dispersal point. Allied analysts speculated it may have been intended as a launching ground for long-range Ar-234 reconnaissance missions over France and Switzerland, or even as part of an aborted plan to base V-1 flying bombs in concealed firing positions across southern Germany. Post-war interviews with captured Luftwaffe engineers lend credence to the underground airfield theory. In 1946, the interrogation of Oberingenieur Wilhelm K., formerly of Heinkel's design bureau, included repeated references to forest runways in Baden-Württemberg. He described operations where aircraft were towed by night into hidden caverns, fueled from underground tanks, and launched at dawn through camouflaged openings. His testimony was marked useful by Operation Lusty officers, America's secret program to capture German aviation technology, and then classified. The documents resurfaced only partially in the 1990s, stripped of location details. Adding to the mystery is the disappearance of aerial reconnaissance negatives. The April 16, 1945, mission report from the 10th Photo Reconnaissance Group survives, but the original photographic plates do not. The report's description, cleared strips in dense woodland consistent with dispersal fields, remains tantalizing. Yet the images were supposedly destroyed in a storage fire in 1951 at RAF Medmenham. Historians familiar with wartime archiving practices doubt such an incident would have selectively destroyed only this set. During the Cold War, rumors of the Black Forest airfield resurfaced when American military engineers, surveying the area for potential radar sites, detected unusually regular subsurface voids on seismic scans. The report, filed in 1958 by US Army engineers based in Stuttgart, mentioned cavity anomalies consistent with tunnels or bunkers, but concluded the matter had no immediate military significance. Locals who worked on forestry, crews in the 1960s claimed to have stumbled upon bricked-up tunnel mouths sealed with reinforced concrete, often bearing rusted fittings that appeared of wartime origin. What might have been hidden there remains the central question. The Allies had already secured known jet production centers at Nordhausen, Oberammergau, and Prague. Yet the secrecy surrounding the Freiburg region, coupled with the seizure of French roadworks debris, suggests an additional installation existed, one never formally acknowledged. Some researchers propose it may have served as a fallback hub for Project Morgenrot, designed to test and disperse the He-162 into areas inaccessible to Allied bombing. Others argue it was part of a larger German effort to construct mobile launch sites for advanced weapons, possibly even a base intended to transfer captured Allied technology, given the proximity to Swiss borders and smuggling routes. Archival silences deepen the suspicion. In the Bundesarchiv at Freiburg, where Luftwaffe records are stored, gaps appear in the files covering aircraft dispersal operations in Baden-Württemberg. Entire folders from early 1945 are missing. American records from Operation Lusty contain cross-references to Black Forest recoveries, but the actual annexes are absent. French intelligence files on the region remain sealed under a 90-year classification rule, not due to lift until 2037. For the local population, memory persists in fragments. Elderly residents recall Allied soldiers questioning them about hidden aerodromes after the war. Others speak of sealed shafts in the forest floor, covered with earth but too precisely cut to be natural. Hunters and hikers occasionally report hearing hollow echoes beneath their feet in certain parts of the Bleiburg woods, as though walking atop vast underground chambers. The story of the ghost airfield beneath the Black Forest illustrates not only the extremes of German wartime secrecy, but also the Allied determination to suppress certain discoveries. While most Luftwaffe installations were documented and dismantled, this one seems deliberately erased, its evidence gathered and locked away. The motivation remains unclear. Was it to conceal advanced technology, prevent Soviet access, or simply bury an episode that defied the official narrative of total Allied knowledge? Today, the forest grows undisturbed, its pines concealing whatever may lie beneath. Satellite imaging reveals nothing unusual, and modern roads have overwritten wartime tracks. Yet the testimonies, missing documents, and classified debris continue to haunt researchers. The Black Forest Airfield stands as a symbol of the war's unresolved shadows, a place that officially never existed, yet left enough traces to disturb those who look too closely. Until the sealed files are opened, or the forest floor gives up its hidden structures, the truth will remain buried, like the tunnels themselves, under layers of silence, secrecy, and time. Chapter 3. Operation Harpoon's Missing Intelligence Files. On June 12, 1942, the Mediterranean became the stage for one of the bloodiest convoy battles of the war. Operation Harpoon was conceived as a dual-pronged resupply mission to keep Malta alive. The island, battered by Axis air raids and starved of food, fuel, and ammunition, was a linchpin in the struggle for control of North Africa. The plan was simple in design but brutal in execution. 6 merchant vessels would sail from Gibraltar, escorted by Royal Navy cruisers and destroyers, while a second convoy, Operation Vigorous, sailed simultaneously from Alexandria. Both were to converge on Malta, overwhelming Axis defenses. What happened instead was a disaster of attrition. Harpoon lost half its ships, and Vigorous turned back entirely. Yet in the rubble of Malta's survival emerged a mystery that official records glossed over. Somewhere in the chaos, a set of classified intelligence files vanished. Files that may have contained evidence of German nuclear ambitions. The convoy departed Gibraltar on June 12th under heavy guard. Its escorts included the cruisers HMS Kenya and HMS Liverpool, along with 9 destroyers. The Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica attacked almost immediately, bombers swarming from Sardinia and Sicily. On June 14th, the convoy was engaged by Italian naval forces in what became known as the Battle of Pantelleria. The merchant vessel Tannenbaugh was set ablaze and abandoned. The tanker Kentucky was sunk by air attack, but among the survivors and the wreckage lay another story, one hidden from the official communiques. Declassified fragments of Admiralty correspondence in file ADM 223-873, released in the late 1970s, refer cryptically to loss of pouch en route during Operation Harpoon. The pouch in question was not a diplomatic satchel, but a naval signals pouch, carried aboard one of the freighters, reportedly the merchant ship Chant. Inside were ultra-derived decrypts, carefully selected intercepts of Axis communications, along with analytical summaries prepared by Bletchley Park's Hut 4. These were intended for the Combined Intelligence Center in Malta, where British analysts worked alongside American officers to monitor Axis supply lines to North Africa. But according to a heavily redacted internal report, the Harpoon pouch also contained intercepts of unusual traffic, references to shipments moving through the Balkans under SS control, marked by code words Sonnenkorn and Lichtstoff. Some historians believe these references related to shipments of uranium oxide or heavy water, suggesting early German nuclear research. The pouch was last recorded when Chant suffered heavy damage from aerial bombing off Pantelleria. Surviving crew were taken aboard HMS Bedouin before Chant was abandoned. Bedouin herself was sunk hours later by Italian cruisers. It was during this chaos that the pouch disappeared. Whether it went down with Chant, was destroyed aboard Bedouin, or was captured during the Italian boarding actions, has never been conclusively determined. Italian naval records provide a tantalizing clue. Reports from the torpedo boat Pegaso describe boarding an abandoned freighter, recovering sealed cases with English lettering, and transferring them to the cruiser Raimondo Montecuccoli. The cases were then logged at La Spezia naval base before disappearing from the Italian archive. When Italy capitulated in 1943, many of its records fell into German hands. Post-war interrogations of German naval staff reveal hints of British signal material arriving in Berlin in late 1942, though these statements were vague and often contradictory. Soviet intelligence files add another dimension. A KGB defector in the 1980s claimed that Moscow had intercepted references to the Harpoon pouch in captured German documents. According to his testimony, the Germans had passed the contents to the Sicherheitsdienst for analysis. Some of the material, he claimed, included not only ultra-decrypts but also Allied assessments of German science programs, including summaries that mentioned uranium from Yakimov. If true, it would mean the loss of the pouch provided Berlin with evidence that London was tracking its nuclear materials, a revelation that may have influenced subsequent German efforts at secrecy. The British Admiralty's handling of the incident only deepens the suspicion. After the war, an internal review into convoy communications noted the loss of certain signals material in Harpoon, but declared it of no lasting value. Yet this contradicts reports from Malta in late 1942, where intelligence officers complained of missing decrypts that would have clarified Axis fuel shipments to Tripoli. The absence of these files hampered interdiction efforts at a critical juncture, just as Rommel prepared his push toward El Alamein. Historians digging through the archives in the 1990s uncovered more anomalies. Admiralty file ADM 1999-2136 contains a post-action report by Rear Admiral Algernon Willis, commander of Force H. His report refers obliquely to special traffic compromised, but the passage is heavily censored. Likewise, Malta's Combined Intelligence Center records for June 1942 include a gap in ultra-summaries corresponding precisely to the Harpoon timeline. The missing decrypts were never reconstructed, suggesting they had been destroyed or removed deliberately. Crew testimonies collected decades later complicate the picture further. A surviving officer from Chant recalled that before abandoning ship, he saw a naval officer from the convoy escort carrying a locked pouch into a lifeboat. The officer never reappeared in Malta, presumed killed when Bedouin went down. Another survivor insisted that when they were picked up by Italian sailors, the pouch was already in enemy hands. Conflicting memories, recorded 30 years after the event, leave no certainty, only shadows. The Americans showed interest too. OSS files from late 1942 mention loss of British intercept material in Med Convoy, noting possible compromise of cryptographic methods. Though Ultra remained secure, the Germans never broke Enigma's full complexity. The content itself may have been invaluable, particularly if it hinted at Allied awareness of nuclear shipments. US Army intelligence quietly inquired whether such references could explain German attempts to divert uranium transport routes through Czechoslovakia later that year. The British response was curt and evasive. In the aftermath of Harpoon, Malta limped on, supplied only by the battered remnants of later convoys such as Pedestal. Yet the question of the missing pouch lingered in quiet corridors of Whitehall. Why were references to Balkan uranium shipments included in the Malta-bound summaries at all? Was it to alert the Americans stationed there, or to build leverage with the Soviets by showing Allied awareness of German science? The decision to send such sensitive material through a convoy route known to be deadly seems reckless, unless its loss served another purpose. By 1946, the matter had been buried. Official histories of the Mediterranean campaigns omit any mention of lost intelligence files. The Admiralty's own records remain inconsistent, riddled with redactions. The pouch itself has never surfaced in any archive, British, German, or Italian. Some believe it lies still at the bottom of the Sicilian Channel, encased in a corroding steel case within the wreck of Chant. Others suspect it was quietly destroyed to prevent political fallout during the Cold War, when revelations of Allied knowledge of German nuclear activity would have complicated relations with Moscow. Today, Operation Harpoon is remembered as a costly failure in the effort to sustain Malta, but for those who study the war's hidden dimensions, it stands as something more. the story of an intelligence file that vanished in fire and salt water, its contents erased from history. Whether by accident, betrayal, or design, the missing pouch remains one of the Mediterranean's unsolved mysteries, a ghost in the archives of World War II. Until the seas yield their wrecks, or sealed files are opened, the truth of what vanished in Harpoon will remain locked in silence, as impenetrable as the codes it once contained. Chapter 4: The Cold War's Hidden Arctic Stations. By the mid-1950s, the Arctic had become more than a frozen wilderness. For NATO and the Soviet Union, it was a frontier of survival, a place where the shortest bomber routes and missile trajectories intersected the poles. Publicly, the West described the construction of the distant early warning line, radar outposts stretching across Greenland, Canada, and Alaska to warn of Soviet attack. Less discussed, buried in layers of classification, was a parallel program of covert Arctic stations built not simply to detect aircraft, but to recover secrets left behind by the defeated Reich. It is within this hidden history that we find Operation Iceworm and the enigmatic Northfall, projects that officially never existed yet appear in scattered memoranda and oral testimony. The story begins in 1952, when American engineers from the US Army Corps of Engineers arrived in Thule, Greenland. Their mission, under Project Iceworm, was ostensibly to test construction techniques beneath the ice for future radar stations. Yet accompanying them were officers from the US Air Force Office of Special Investigations and the Counterintelligence Corps, whose files show no relation to radar. Declassified fragments from the National Archives reveal repeated references to unscheduled recoveries and legacy containers found in ice caves and fjords. One memo, dated January 1954, notes transfer of 4 units marked Reichsadler insignia, origin Norway, to Camp Northfall. No such camp appears on official maps. Accounts from Norwegian villagers collected after the war provide the missing link. As German forces retreated from Finnmark in 1944, they buried supply caches along the tundra, some marked with disguised cairns. Locals later recalled seeing metal drums stenciled not with fuel markings, but with strange codes such as RK-Fizz-44. When NATO forces returned to survey these areas in the 1950s, they began unearthing containers not of munitions, but of paper, magnetic reels, and sealed film canisters. According to one Canadian officer who spoke anonymously decades later, some reels bore the insignia of the SS Ahnenerbe, others the stamps of the Reich Main Security Office. Their contents remain unknown. One station, established on the island of Jan Mayen under the codename Northfall, appeared briefly in declassified budgetary ledgers in 1956, before vanishing entirely. Logs from nearby weather stations reference unusual American flights in and out, sometimes using unmarked C-124 Globemaster transports. Norwegian military police records show that in March 1957, a fishing vessel strayed too close to Jan Mayen and was detained for 3 days without explanation. The fishermen later told journalists they had seen crates lifted by crane into cavern mouths on the shore. Their account was dismissed as confusion, yet the timing corresponds exactly with an internal US memo noting successful recovery of Arctic consignment number 7. Perhaps most unsettling is the sudden closure of some of these stations. In 1958, a US Army team operating near Bodo, Norway, reported ice instability as the reason for abandoning their installation. Yet a draft report, heavily censored, mentions contamination and the necessity of total removal of materials. Witnesses claimed that sealed cylinders were flown to West Germany under guard. The location where they were stored has never been disclosed. What could these caches have contained? Theories range from wartime intelligence files on occupied populations to German research on advanced metallurgy and nuclear physics. Some believe they held interrogation records from concentration camps, smuggled north during the Reich's collapse, and buried to prevent their capture. Others argue they were repositories of captured Allied intelligence, taken from missions like PQ-17 and Operation Harpoon, and preserved in hopes of a post-war resurgence. Whatever the truth, the Americans and their NATO allies treated the materials with extraordinary secrecy, as though they represented both a treasure and a danger. During the 1960s, Soviet reconnaissance picked up unusual signals traffic emanating from Greenland. Declassified KGB reports mention phantom stations, broadcasting in bursts, using cipher groups inconsistent with standard NATO communications. Soviet analysts believed these transmissions were linked to intelligence operations against Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. But another interpretation is possible: that the stations were transmitting catalogues of recovered German material back to central archives, encoded so that even NATO allies were unaware of their contents. The human element surfaces in oral histories. American servicemen stationed in Greenland recall rumors of ghost crates brought in by airlift, guarded by men who never wore insignia. One recalls hearing an officer refer to the Reich tapes in hushed tones during a briefing. Another described watching engineers unpack metal canisters filled with what looked like tightly wound film reels, immediately sealed again and flown out. No explanation was ever provided. By the early 1970s, many of the Arctic stations had been abandoned, their structures collapsing into the ice. Official histories present this as a matter of cost and obsolescence, as missile technology rendered early warning lines less relevant. Yet files in the Danish National Archive reveal a telling anomaly. In 1971, Denmark formally requested an inventory of US sites dismantled in Greenland. The reply listed fewer stations than Danish observers had personally visited, omitting locations they knew had existed. The discrepancy was never resolved. The last whisper of these hidden recoveries came during the 1980s, when a Danish journalist uncovered references to Northfall shipments in declassified NATO logistics summaries. He traced one consignment to Ramstein Air Base in 1959, where it was logged as Special Technical Material, Origin Arctic. Requests for clarification were met with silence. The journalist's articles were widely dismissed as speculative, yet his notes contained precise file numbers that later researchers confirmed as genuine. Today, the Arctic's secrets lie beneath layers of snow and time. Some wrecked stations can still be seen from satellite imagery: collapsed tunnels, rusting vehicles, skeletal remains of prefabricated huts. Yet the true heart of the mystery lies not in radar dishes or weather logs, but in the sealed containers moved under darkness, marked with eagles and runes, flown out under NATO guard. Their contents may still sit in vaults in Washington, London, or Bonn, their significance never revealed. The Cold War's hidden Arctic stations were not merely watchtowers against the Soviet Union. They were grave robbers of history, reaching into the ice to extract the buried remnants of a war that refused to die. In their secrecy, they reveal a truth more unsettling than any radar screen: that the Second World War did not end cleanly in 1945, but lingered in frozen caches, coded transmissions, and sealed crates carried through the polar night. And until those files are opened, the silence of the Arctic will continue to conceal the shadows of both wars, hot and cold, that shaped the 20th century. Chapter 5: The Erased Massacre at Bleiburg Pass. May 1945. The war in Europe was officially over, yet on the borders of Austria and Yugoslavia, a catastrophe unfolded that few dared to record. The event became known as the Bleiburg Massacre, an episode where tens of thousands of retreating soldiers and civilians, many of them Croatian Ustaše, Slovene collaborators, Chetniks, and remnants of the Wehrmacht, attempted to surrender to British forces near the village of Bleiburg. Instead, they were forcibly repatriated to Tito's partisans. What followed were summary executions, forced marches, and mass graves stretching from the Austrian border deep into Yugoslavia. For decades, the episode remained unspoken, erased from official Western accounts and denied by communist authorities. Only fragments, scattered across British and Yugoslav archives, hint at the scale of what occurred and at the uneasy complicity of Allied officials who allowed it to happen. On May 15, 1945, columns of retreating forces reached Bleiburg, seeking to surrender to the 5th Corps of the British 8th Army. The roads were clogged with civilians, women, children, the elderly, mixed with defeated soldiers. Eyewitnesses later recalled British tanks positioned on the surrounding hills, their barrels pointed toward the crowds. Representatives of the retreating forces pleaded with British officers, among them Brigadier Patrick Scott of the 38th Infantry Brigade, for safe passage into Austria. Instead, Scott relayed an order from higher command. All surrendering forces were to be turned over to Yugoslav partisans. Survivors recalled disbelief giving way to panic as the realization set in that repatriation meant certain death. British records confirm the policy. Signals traffic between Field Marshal Harold, Alexander's headquarters in Caserta and Whitehall, included references to repatriation of surrendered Yugoslav nationals. The operational logs from May 14th to 17, however, are conspicuously missing from War Office archives. What survives are fragments, memoranda marked political directive rather than military order, suggesting that decisions were being shaped in London for reasons beyond immediate battlefield necessity. Britain, now calculating the balance of power in post-war Europe, saw in Tito a bulwark against Soviet expansion. To alienate him in the war's final days by sheltering his enemies risked destabilizing the fragile peace. For the surrendering masses, the consequences were immediate. Survivors describe columns being marched at gunpoint across the border into Yugoslavia, stripped of their possessions, and driven on foot for hundreds of kilometers. Those unable to continue were executed along the roadside. At Kočevski Rog in Slovenia, entire groups were herded into mineshafts and blown apart with explosives. Others were lined up along ravines and shot, their bodies buried in hastily covered pits. Estimates of the dead vary widely, from 40,000 to over 100,000. The exact numbers remain elusive, buried in silence and denial. British officers on the ground knew the fate awaiting those they handed over. In post-war testimony, Captain Nigel Nicholson recalled the desperation of civilians begging not to be repatriated and admitted the British were well aware of the massacres that would follow. Yet official policy remained unchanged. When Parliament later addressed the matter, government ministers dismissed allegations of complicity, insisting that repatriations were conducted according to international agreements. The archival silences tell a different story. Tho 371 Troms 48161, a Foreign Office file declassified in part during the 1980s, contains cables from Alexander's staff referencing liability of charges of war crimes should orders be scrutinized. Sections of the file remain redacted to this day. For Yugoslavia, the massacre was erased from history. Under Tito's rule, any discussion of Bleiburg was suppressed, labeled fascist propaganda. Survivors who spoke of the marches were silenced, imprisoned, or exiled. Mass graves were left unmarked, hidden in forests and ravines. It was only after the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s that systematic excavations began. Forensic teams uncovered pits filled with skeletal remains, many showing signs of execution, hands bound with wire, skulls shattered by close-range gunfire. These discoveries corroborated survivor testimonies long dismissed as exaggeration. Western silence lasted almost as long. The British archives, still incomplete, reveal a pattern of erasure. Operational reports from the 5th Corps for May 1945 are missing entire days of entries. War diaries from units stationed near Bleiburg contain abrupt gaps, with one officer scribbling in the margin, "Orders not for inclusion." Historians who sought to investigate were met with resistance. In the 1960s, an inquiry by the Sunday Times was quietly dropped after consultations with the Foreign Office. Internal memoranda reveal concern that publication would embarrass relations with Belgrade. The politics of the Cold War ensured that Bleiburg remained untouchable. Tito, courted by the West after his 1948 split with Stalin, was seen as too valuable to undermine. Acknowledging British complicity in mass repatriations would have risked destabilizing NATO's southern flank. And so the story remained buried, mentioned only in whispers by émigré communities, dismissed by official historians. When the archives began to open in the late 20th century, the fragments were enough to suggest a cover-up. Declassified MI6 reports describe large-scale partisan reprisals against surrendered elements, but carefully avoid the term massacre. One file notes that British officers were instructed to avoid written orders when dealing with Yugoslav handovers. Another hints at deliberate destruction of evidence, with Alexander himself authorizing the weeding of War Office records in 1947. For the survivors, silence was another wound. Testimonies collected in exile recount the betrayals with bitterness. One Croatian refugee, interviewed in 1975, described the moment when British officers ordered his group across the Drava River. "We thought we were walking to safety. Instead, we walked into our graves." Such voices, long marginalized, only gained recognition decades later, when political shifts allowed the subject to resurface. Today, the name Bleiburg carries weight across the Balkans. Annual commemorations are marked by controversy, as political factions contest its meaning, victimhood, collaboration, betrayal. Yet the underlying fact remains. A massacre occurred, enabled by the silence of those who might have prevented it. The missing British files, the redacted cables, and the erased war diaries all suggest that the truth was not merely forgotten but deliberately buried. The Bleiburg tragedy is a reminder that the Second World War did not end cleanly in May 1945. Its aftermath was shaped as much by political calculation as by battlefield victory. In the desperation to secure alliances and redraw borders, entire populations were sacrificed, their stories suppressed for generations. The archives, where they exist, remain incomplete. The graves, where they have been uncovered, tell a story written not in ink, but in bone. The erased massacre at Bleiburg Pass lingers as one of the war's darkest, unresolved chapters. It is a silence measured not only in missing pages of history, but in the unmarked graves that stretch across the forests of Slovenia and Croatia. And until every file is unsealed, every grave accounted for, the question will remain: how much did those in London know, and how much did they choose to forget? When the records close and the voices fade, what lingers are the questions that history could not smother. Empty shelves speak louder than archives filled with certainty, and unmarked graves of memory haunt more deeply than monuments of stone. In these shadows, truth is never declared. It leaks, fractured, carried by whispers across decades like signals in static. To pursue it is to walk blindfolded into a labyrinth, where every turn offers a fragment, but never the whole. Perhaps the most unsettling secret is not what was concealed, but the knowledge that someone once chose concealment, believing silence to be safer than revelation. And so, the darkness waits, as patient as ice, guarding the remnants of forgotten wars. It does not offer answers, only the reminder that some doors remain closed not because they are locked, but because those who sealed them knew what waited on the other side.